Feels so weird to have a meeting while the sun's still out.
Depends on where you are in the in the country.
Okay, we are recording and live.
Great. Thank you for joining. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Let me go through really quick. With that said, let's start off with the Pledge of Allegiance. Task Force Member Smith, can you go ahead and do the Pledge of Allegiance? I believe that Jasmine will go ahead and display it for you.
Yes.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great job. Thank you for that. Jasmine, do you want to do a roll call?
Absolutely. Chair Jonathan Wilson.
Here.
Vice Chair Daniel Zamukla.
Here.
Task Force Member Marcus Smith.
Here.
Task Force Member Krupa Desai.
Here.
Task Force Member Giselle Washington.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Excellent. At this stage, let's move on to item number 4, approval of the minutes. Does anybody want to make a motion?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
Excellent. Let the record be noted. Jasmine, if you can please do the roll call vote.
Sure. Chair Wilson.
Aye.
Vice Chair Zamukla.
Abstain.
Task Force Member Smith.
Aye.
Task Force Member Desai.
Aye.
Task Force Member Washington.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Great. At this time, I'd like to move into item number 5, which is public comment. So this time is set aside for public comment. The public is given the opportunity to address the Social Justice Task Force on any item within its responsibility pursuant to the Brown Act. The Social Justice Task Force cannot take action on items not listed on the posted agenda. However, each speaker will be allotted 2 minutes, and time may be limited or increased based on the discretion of the task force. This public comment period is to address the Social Justice Task Force on agenda items and/or items of general interest within the jurisdiction of the Social Justice Task Force. If there's anyone who didn't speak up or sign up to speak and wishes to provide comment, please use the raise your hand feature in Zoom. Is there anybody? Everybody I see here is affiliated. Is there anybody, Jasmine, that may have provided desire to speak publicly?
We didn't get any submissions.
Okay. Well, why don't we move on to item number 6. This is where we finalize the actionable recommendations brought forward by the Public Safety Committee. So this is a good opportunity for Aspire to speak. So I'd like to ask, can a representative from Aspire please lead the discussion? Do we have, I thought I saw Diane on here.
Sorry, it's hard to unmute with my device. Hello and good evening, everybody. Great to be with you as always. And I wanted to say that for our first group, we wanted to hear an update from the Public Safety Subcommittee and thank them for such a great and engaging conversation in the last task force meeting. It was wonderful to see the ideas that are percolating with yet another work group. So I wanted to check in just to see if there were any updates, thoughts that the subcommittee wanted to offer to the full task force before we take a look at our next group?
I did have something. Coming out of last night's city council meeting, I know that the public safety report was delayed for several reasons. And I know that city council was, I'd say, generally not very happy about that. I too would like to express that although I want to make sure that the information is correct that's being presented, that it is of utmost importance, especially as we make these recommendations. I think specifically as it relates to recommendation number 3, we want to make sure that whatever is in that report accurately reflects what is going on in the city. I think the other thing too is I know that there were several members of the community who expressed their opposition to the Public Safeties Committee's recommendation to remove 10 police officers from the department. I did want to state that while I would, of course, absolutely want to continue looking into, I don't want us to get into a place where, as social justice warriors, I think as many of us feel that we are not, we're not making a recommendation without doing our due diligence. And I think part of that is going to be a lot of, reviewing that report and before we can officially state what recommendation number 3 actually looks like. Jasmine, I wasn't sure if there was anything from city staff perspective, either that happened today or anything coming out of last night's meeting that we should be aware of as it relates to that report.
So the only thing I should probably add is I believe council will be discussing the public safety item at the April 18th meeting. So, we'll make sure to keep all the task force members updated on that. But you're right, it is probably something that at the very least, the public safety subcommittee, but the task force members should digest and look at before we kind of finalize the recommendations.
Awesome.
And then I'm sorry. Oh,
Yes.
Jeff, I have one more thing to add. And I went back and looked at looked through that meeting from the Public Safety Committee, and I believe the sheriff representative was never identified, so we don't know the information presented, but do we have the identity? Do we know where that information came from? Specifically, was it just the report was very confusing?
I'm not entirely sure, and I think that may have been the reasoning behind some of the council members kind of wanting to make sure that when we do have this conversation that all the facts are verified and the public receives up-to-date and correct information. But I'm not sure of the identity of the person.
Just to kind of really, I think all of us, or not all of us, but some of us clearly were on the call last night. I agree with Vice Chair Samilpa in my disappointment. However, in addition to that, I also want to make sure, I know he just said this, but I also want to reiterate, it's very important that the facts and numbers that are presented in these reports or any updates are accurate, because we are depending on that for a recommendation. So that's a plea to the city as well. I do think that Councilmember Horvath's comment around the data was, reflective of a lot of things that maybe we've seen. And so I think that's something that we need to make sure it's very clear that we understand where the data is coming from, the data is accurate, and that we can rely on it for quoting.
Right. So I'm just going to observe, because we are being recorded in the public forum. This is a great conversation. I'm going to invite you to, however, speak with greater context for those who would have not listened in on the call last night. So as you frame this up, just making sure nobody gets left behind in the discussion. So I'm going to ask the vice chair if you could just summarize what were 2 or 3 of the central points of concern that were articulated by the council.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to, again, set the stage, I believe city staff was supposed to report last night in last night's city council meeting on the public safety report that I believe we've been waiting on for a few months. I know that council member D'Amico had mentioned he was definitely waiting on, I think he said like October, November, and was looking forward to seeing it in March, which is where we are now are. The information that I believe may have either been incorrect or not verified was noted by city manager and Jasmine, please correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that there were a couple of questions within specifically the percentage of increase of crime. I believe since last year, that was one of the discrepancies that was discussed. I believe Councilmember Horvath had asked to verify if there was a number that was stated versus a number that was in an actual report. There was a discrepancy between the two numbers. And that was one thing that the city manager had mentioned that he would go back and confirm all of that for the next meeting.
Very good. And your point is extremely well taken that this task force certainly wants to ensure that it has accurate information to inform what you ultimately want to recommend to council on a variety of matters that are impacted by that information.
Right. One thing I did want to know, and again, we'll see this in the timing, is just the difference of when that percentage actually shows an increase. I would like to take a look if that information is available for whatever the percentage was before the 2020 pandemic versus what it is now. I know that crime rates just in general went down everywhere because nobody was outside. So I think that is something for us to definitely take a look at, where I think a number might be a little bit more jarring compared to where it was last year or 2 years ago, just given the circumstances of the world. I definitely hear everything that many of our constituents said on the call yesterday, that they are very concerned and want to make sure that the way I sort of interpreted what their concern was is that we're not just falling into a movement and looking into what, actually thinking critically about what police reform or defunding the police or whatever you want to call it actually looks like, as compared to just, we're just going to take off 10. I definitely, I'm confident in our public safety committee that they've also done their due diligence, and would definitely love to speak to that committee as well to see how they arrived at that 10 number and that recommendation.
And do you know if the intention was the reduction by 10 would then create the avenue for a resource team approach that would replace law enforcement response in certain situations? Is that part and parcel together, or did they come forward as 2 separate matters?
My understanding is that they're separate, but Jasmine, I'm not sure if you happen to have that context as well.
Sorry about that. I was just looking at something. Diane, do you mind repeating the question that you asked?
Yes, I was wondering if the recommendation for reducing 10 law enforcement spots is linked to the idea under consideration of creating a resource team approach that would be on tap to respond in lieu of law enforcement. Are those linked, or are those 2 separate matters?
So I think it's separate. The recommendation to reduce the amount of deputies was something that was submitted by the Public Safety Commission. It's not something that was ever voted on by council or even brought up by the city council. So yeah, the different avenues of providing and supplementing the sheriff's department with mental health experts and such is something that council has discussed, and it's probably something they'll continue to support. But the reduction of deputies is something that was specifically submitted by Public Safety Commission.
Fantastic, thank you. And in the spirit of the 3 very robust areas that the Public Safety Subcommittee of this task force is taking on, in addition to this very important information we've mentioned from the public safety report, I know we chatted a little bit about the benefit of also tapping into some non-city resources like advocacy and research groups that are also looking at the 3 areas that you all are looking at: expungement of legal records, decriminalizing sex work, and what was it? And remediation for loss or personal damage when cannabis was not legal, if there could be some funding to offset that. Wondered if you all had any updates about that or any thoughts you wanted to share with the task force in general about that, because I'm encouraging certainly for you all to fully tap into the information from the city departments and other commissions and boards, and to augment that with information from sources that may even broaden the data you have to reference and use in support of the ideas you want to bring forward. Any thoughts either of you want to share about that?
Can I just request that we enlarge the font or the page? Down, yep, just down. Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Very good. And sorry, and I'm inviting Krupa or Daniel, either one of you who want to, any other things you want to highlight about other information you'd like to tap into as you build out those recommendation areas.
I'm sorry, I'm not tracking the question. You said other information that we want to tap into, or is it an update from our subcommittee meeting, which is additional information that we had wanted to tap into? I just want to make sure I'm responsive to what you're.
I'm inviting that as you talk about an update from your subcommittee meeting. One thing we didn't speak about with the whole group in depth was about also inviting resources, guest speakers from advocacy and research and other kind of groups that go beyond the city representatives, and why that might be of value to the areas that you are building recommendations around.
Got it.
One thing we discussed was possibly, inviting the district attorney to discuss, because some of these fall under District Attorney Gascon's office, such as the expungement of the nonviolent cannabis related offenses. Just because ultimately his office decides who decides the charges, to present the charges to court. So we discussed inviting the district attorney.
Right. We for the rest of the task force, last week we spoke with the head of the Legislative Affairs Department, which is also a department of one, Hernando Molina, who it was just like a great US government class for an hour. That was a nice refresher for just what we can and can't do. I think that's definitely been a question that we've been asking ourselves since day one, is like, these are our recommendations, but are these even recommendations that we can make happen? What has to go to city council? What has to go to of a citywide vote on the ballot? What has to, as Task Force Member Smith is mentioning, has to go to the DA's office? Like, I think that was a lot of our questions with Ednan last week, and I'm still a little unclear, if I'm being completely honest. Just it was a lot of information that probably should have brushed up a little bit more on taking on this role, but it's a great ongoing conversation that I'm happy to continue having with my subcommittee members as well, because I think it'll definitely help us frame the best way and I think it'll help us frame how we most effectively make these recommendations based off of what we can actually make happen. And if not, who do we need to speak to or make a recommendation to if it's outside of city council, to see that these things can actually happen? Because I do recognize that, although we are representing West Hollywood, we do have the potential to make impact, not just, within our own community, but at the, county, state, city, potentially national level. So recognizing what we can do and what we, have to tap into other areas for.
Yeah, excellent point. And what I'm going to do is do that elaboration myself. So I think inviting the district attorney's office or designated representative is absolutely in the right direction. I am going to strongly lift up the value of seeing advocacy groups as tremendous resources. They have researched both the issue at hand and related issues, as well as the strategies and approaches that have strong legal possibility of consideration. Doesn't mean that you have to rubber stamp anything they do, but I think they expand the conversation for the task force, not only in the pragmatic ways, but they both have to know the systems, the laws, the processes, and they know from the underserved standpoint, the perspectives and arguments of where the openings in the laws and the processes could exist. And that seems to be very aligned with what this task force is interested in. Where is there an opportunity to expand, to reshape, to reconsider status quo? So just want to lift up identifying and tapping into these groups. And in this particular area, I think it's both those who have been long in the work just from the beginning of trying to move towards cannabis legalization. So they know the process backwards, forwards, up and down, as well as those who work in the spaces of reentry, especially around expungement of charges on one's record and ensuring that does not remain as a barrier for other aspects of life, employment, housing, so forth. And so just a couple of avenues of resource to definitely keep in mind. Updates from your subcommittee meeting. Did we cut short anything else you all wanted to highlight from your last meeting and discussion?
I don't think this was, oh, go ahead, Krupa.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I think Daniel and Marcus covered most things. I think that the thing I just keep pausing on, because I feel like we've circled back to this both in whole group sessions and in subcommittee meetings, which is a little bit of a barrier, is the question that Daniel raised around like what is within our control to do, because the framing of the recommendations depend on it. So I do think we got great information around like where we might be able to move, but it's incomplete still. And that says nothing about sort of your recommendation, Diane, for us to invite advocacy groups. So I don't mean to sidetrack that. I'm just naming it because I think where I get stalled is I feel like we're cycling on the same questions.
Yeah.
One,
and it,
one thing, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, and certainly one of the benefits is an option we haven't talked about. Sometimes there are measures underway, again, that advocacy groups could be a good source of information on, in which the City of West Hollywood Council might want to actually endorse that piece of legislation. So while it may not be in your jurisdiction of control, the support you give could help legislation, policy matters that are aligned move forward with success. And knowing about that may be something that leads to a recommendation from your subcommittee. So I think your point is really well taken, and I just don't want you all to feel thwarted. Having served as a commissioner for a long time, what I know is there is the direct, the indirect, and then the super special indirect ways of influencing and keeping things on the table with creativity.
So I just have a question for the subcommittee. I'm kind of bridging different conversations that I've heard, and I know that there is an effort underway to do new 3-year contracts for social services. Is there an opportunity to provide an additional recommendation to have set aside funds for legal nonprofits that focus on helping to get reparations for those who have been convicted of sex crimes or cannabis offenses? So, I mean, I think that's a very tangible recommendation that we can probably maybe say or put forth as a task force. I would just ask the question of, is that something that you thought of around, how do we enable other groups, that are already working on things, help us achieve our mission as well? So maybe that's something. I'll pause for a minute and just hear your thoughts.
Actually, that was going to be something I was going to bring up, but in a similar direction. I know with Commissioner Roche on the Public Safety Commission, we have been trying to set up time to just talk about what's going on in their world. I guess my question to you, Jasmine, is what are the other departments, commissioners, task force, councils, etc., within the city? Because I do feel like there is overlap, and that's something I sort of took away from last night's council city meeting, is like, I understand what our role is, especially I think that there's, obviously there's an economic commission, there's like a lot of different departments talking about the same thing. I think at that point, what is the best way, to Jonathan's point, of like making sure we're all communicating, we're all like, everyone's being, we're all checking our boxes across the board. And also that we're not, I mean, for whatever reason, I'm just throwing this out there, like, what if as, the public safety subcommittee, we are like completely against removing 10, positions. I just want to make sure that those conversations are happening so that when it does reach the city council level from every, task force, commission, et cetera, that there is a unified voice.
Yeah, that's a good question. So my first thought, I know the Human Services Commission will be visited by, I believe, the social services team again on April 12th. And if there are any other items, for example, like expanding legal services to help with folks who have non-violent cannabis-related crimes or non-violent sex-related crimes, we can provide that input at that meeting. So I can always send that information out. But I think it's also something that we should talk about how we want to approach engagement before you all finalize the recommendations. I'm sure you'll want to hear from, members of other commissions and advisory boards, including the public. So we can, at least in my mind, figure out some meetings to invite those folks where they're literally just set aside for community listening sessions. So that way you all can get that input and implement that into the recommendations, or at least your approach for the items that you're positing as recommendations.
And then real quick to go back to Chair Wilson's question, I think one thing that we had talked about within the Public Safety Committee was looking at a reparations tax. I know that cannabis is already very much taxed, not just in this city, but just in Los Angeles in general. I don't know where those dollars go specifically. I don't know if there is an assignment for a specific tax that's implemented. Is there a way to sort of redirect some of those funds? Is there, you know, an additional tax we look into? I just want to understand the lay of the land before we make, you know, because adding an additional tax is a big recommendation, and I recognize that. So I just want to make sure that, you know, we're doing our due diligence.
Yeah, there are a few assignments I'm working on for the Public Safety Subcommittee, just in terms of reaching out to some of those other partners that we kind of talked about. So I'll add that to the list.
Okay.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Public Safety Subcommittee. That was very good. And the next group we wanted to hear from was housing and homelessness.
That is my group, and regrettably, due to conflicts, we couldn't meet. So we're still working through sharing notes and getting time on the calendar.
Fantastic. So we're going to then just structure a very lighter update from your group, just to share out broadly with the whole group the things that are already starting to emerge and be developed in your thoughts in that way. As with all of the subcommittees, the presentations that have come thus far have offered some information, some data related to the areas that you have identified as greatest interest. So for tonight's conversation, I'm going to ask our housing and homelessness subcommittee to talk about, of the presentations you've heard thus far from the city departments and representatives, what are some of the things that they have described that are in the works that you would endorse and say, yes, we think that's a great idea and we support them moving forward to build that out, you know, and implement it because we think it has impact. And I'd like you to then next talk about, and what are the areas and ideas you all have been working on that go beyond what they have presented. So let's just start with the easier part. What have you heard so far that you say, okay, they're on the right path as it relates to those things and we would endorse?
Sounds good. So as far as the outreach and homeless advisory board or existing groups reaching out to folks to see what their needs are, it sounds like there's a good system around that. I've heard surveys, in-person outreach for people going around different camps in the city.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the Saban Community Clinic is the only site in WeHo that has showers for the unhoused. Project Angel Food is another one that came up in our last meeting. They distribute food, and that's absolutely endorsed, but we want to expound upon, like, it sounds like only house people are getting deliveries, and wanting to incorporate the unhoused. Let's see what else I have here.
Great. And as you zero in on that, I'm just echoing what I'm hearing so far. So for these services where you've heard, okay, this service like showers for the unhoused are available, and we'd like to see more of that because there's only one location to our knowledge at this point. food distribution and nutrition through Project Angel Food is contracted and happening. We'd like to see how that could be made available to the unhoused and not just those with documented residences. Okay, keep going. You're on a great path. Cool. That's good stuff.
Thank you for that summary. And then so we have a number that was given to us early on about there being only about 127 homeless people in the city of WeHo. Obviously, this is a moving number, but when the group heard that, the conversation then became, well, let's eradicate it altogether. That is a feasible number, but trying to figure out resources that are LA County resources that will allow for shelter and beds is an ongoing conversation.
If I might speak a little bit, I've done some initial homework on that. Ooh. And that, from my understanding, is a rolling number. So there are maybe 115 people that are taken off the street, and then another 122 come on the street. Yeah. So so I'd probably say the solutioning is probably a little more complex in terms of the eradication period. But that's my own take on that.
Yeah, and I like the boldness of just conceptually saying, if the number is within that range, could we not consider that?
Can you guys hear Diane?
Hey, Diane, I think your sound went out. We lost you for a second. No. Okay.
Keep going. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll get into some of the recommendations. We spoke about wraparound services being number one, mental health, rental assistance, drug services, food, employment assistance, job creation. All of these things exist, some siloed, some components of that group together. So figuring out a recommendation around a holistic approach for the unhoused to have access to those wraparound services. I see Diane nodding. Public owned sites for temporary housing like shelter beds, showers, food distribution, lockers. This is also still a big question mark. The city of WeHo Jasmine looked into like hotels and motels. That's very limited. It sounds like they're affluent and we may not have a space for that.
Can I, if you don't mind,
No, please.
There was a lot of dialogue. There's been a lot of dialogue over meetings and even outside of these meetings. And then keep in mind that, I did the report out to the Human Services group, I believe last month. One of the things that I would love for the subcommittee to look into would be around, and keep in mind, this probably spans the intersectionality, but Black trans people. Okay. There seemed to be a lot of dialogue around not feeling safe and not feeling like there's a place for them to go. And so that's both for MTF and F2M. So I would say that's something to look into as well. I don't want to, that kind of spans multiple different task force and advisory councils, I think, for the city of West Hollywood, but there's an opportunity to partner with another group to
I love that.
figure out a solution. So I don't know, but I recommend maybe thinking about that one a little bit. And another thing, a number for you to think through also is I went back to the numbers that were provided to us by the social services group. And basically, I just kind of did a little bit of analysis on their data. Okay. And really 27 out of every 100 touch points are BIPOC people for social services. So wow. That's a really big, and we're only representing there's only 21% of us in the city of
In
West
the city.
Hollywood, which means that we are we are disproportionately using the social services. So that's something to really, think through in terms of how does that impact, how might that impact some of your recommendations and
Absolutely.
go forward path. So
Thank you so much for that. That is something we've talked about is, pinpointing the demographic, who's using the services, and then are they getting the messaging catered towards them? So
right, and that's funny. What's interesting about that is that is the number of BIPOC people that are using the services. And keep in mind, there are quite a few that don't feel comfortable. So imagine what the numbers could be, right? So
to your point, feeling safe. Thank you, Jonathan.
Fantastic. Are there others who had thoughts you want to share here?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask and just note, I think, while obviously I think that the biggest and most glaring issue to tackle is those that are already experiencing houselessness. I think one thing to also consider is the at-risk group. How does one get there? I think there's definitely a big misconception in terms of it's people who are drug and and alcoholics, and it's so much more. And I think it's wonderful that the city of West Hollywood has become literally the number one place to enact minimum wage, literally in the country. Are there any other factors that might come into play that we should think about that might put somebody at risk? I mean, obviously, I think the increasing prices of affordable housing, the lack of affordable housing, the increased pricing, if there's any businesses that go out of business within the city of West Hollywood that employ maybe lower income people, and now they're not available in the city anymore. I think that's also something to consider and see if I think it definitely taps into the economic subcommittee as well, and just any rumblings of business going out, or reducing in employees or things like that. But considering the at-risk community to sort of think about who can we help before they actually do have to experience homelessness.
That's really good.
Just to kind of add to that, I don't know if anybody knows, but I actually was almost homeless. Had I not had people that could help me, I could have been homeless. I was literally that close to it. So, and that was more of a mental health thing than it was anything else. I think there's something with life changes in mental health that definitely might be on our radar. But just putting it out there that you don't know who's been on the verge and who's going to be on the verge, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely, and as you point out, the many factors of life that cause us to be vulnerable. I do think it is about challenging assumptions and stereotypes of who sits vulnerable to this, because challenging that also could help prioritizing it differently if there is a more truthful depiction of all who sit on the edge of this reality, for sure.
Absolutely. Prevention is on our list, and there are services that the city is providing. I don't think it's touching the right people. So a big fan of that.
Task Force Member Smith wants to.
Jasmine, or Task Force Member Washington, do we know exactly how many beds are available within our city limits currently? If people needed to be housed either temporarily or...
My understanding is that it's 0. We don't have shelter beds in WeHo.
So sorry, I've been having problems with my keypad on my laptop, so it takes me twice as long to unmute. So in terms of temporary shelter in West Hollywood specifically, I believe the Strategic Initiatives Division is working on a project that would identify a site specifically for that, for unhoused folks. So I'm working on getting someone from that division to come to the next subcommittee meeting so we can kind of have that conversation and figure out because it's something that the city is already working on, how you all plan on building on that. I can try and find out from social services staff to for the groups that we contract with, how many beds are available outside of the city of West Hollywood. But I'd have to reach out to them and get that number.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, one of the things we encourage you all, and you're doing a great job, to consider what makes this a compelling consideration for folks who don't engage in this area all the time. And I am curious if anyone is capturing the impact of the pandemic on the unhoused, in terms of what were the implications of how, just proportionally, how much more difficult survival was made, during that period of time, and for all of the things that people were mandated and cautioned to do, to what degree were they able to really be able to take care of self and well-being, or even have access to those things? What was the kind of emergency response system, so to speak, that was put in place to support the needs of the unhoused during the pandemic? If that is not something that was understudy somewhere, that's understandable, but I think that if you could get any indicators of that, that's a compelling add to this conversation that I think should be uplifted.
Noted, thank you.
On that note, I think of people like Task Force Member Morton, and I think of people like, there's a TikToker, her name is Shirley Rains, and she's often out in downtown on Skid Row, I think twice a week, handing out food and services. Very much people who are in the community putting in the work, and I thank you, Task Force Member Morton, for always putting in the work. Like, you are out there and you are doing it. Like, I'm very curious from your perspective, and I know you've been very vocal about this before, seeing that there are no beds, seeing that there is no facility currently, what would you suggest is needed? Like, I have no real idea of like what that actually looks like, but I'd love to get your perspective as well.
Thanks. I think Giselle kind of hit on what I spoke about in our subcommittee meeting. It's, I recognize that we can't take over, the London. That's what everyone was like. We can't just take over hotels, these nice places, and expect them to provide temporary shelter. But what we can do is identify parcels of city-owned land, whether it's parking lots, whether there's a vacant parking lot, or a building that they just tore down that's going to be vacant for, let's say, 4 months. We can identify these parcels and we can make temporary housing until we figure out when the shelter is going to be actually implemented and in place. And I know we have people working on getting beds, but what we need right now and most immediately is temporary shelter until those things are built. So I think it's really finding a way to make these temporary shelters and then offer the wraparound services, because it really does make a difference. Once we get our unhoused community into these apartments, how do they stay there? How do we get them jobs? How do we get them mental health services? How do we keep them in the apartments once, or the temporary shelters once we have that? So it's identifying these parcels where we can take over just temporarily, and then providing people with these wraparound services to better their lives and to keep them off of the streets indefinitely.
Okay. I think of a few just spots that come to mind that to me have just sat empty for a while. Again, I'm not sure if they're owned by the city. There's that lot on Santa Monica and Crescent Heights that has sat there with the wraparound that's real pretty and has, great information, but I haven't seen anything there. There's that old framing store on Santa Monica Boulevard by that really expensive apartment complex that went up a couple years ago, right by Hamburger Mary's. That has continued to sit open. These to me are like big spaces that are empty. And I'm sure that there's rules and all that sort of stuff, but I think, you know, even if it's a conversation that we can have with these private owners of these locations, like, I think that's a huge opportunity to tap into city resources and offer incentives. I mean, like, I know there's incentives for a million other things. I don't see why this can't be part of that list.
Excellent thoughts. Excellent thoughts.
Agreed. I actually visited a motel today, 6700 Sunset, and I serve a very large trans community there. And I know that the city of Los Angeles is paying this 30-room motel on Sunset, and they don't, you know, have much money after it's a subsidized, you know, rent. They don't have much money. So I drop off food there Tuesdays and Thursdays. But even if you could do some type of subsidized, you know, rental space or within this temporary shelter idea, it's not that they're not even, they're willing to pay for it. They don't have all the money in the world, but they're still willing to pay just for a safe place to sleep. So.
Great insights. Absolutely great insights. Well, again, I just want, oh, I'm sorry, Task Force Member Smith, I see your hand. There's brilliance a brew over there. All yours.
No worries. I think the one thing I'm also concerned about, and I think we've addressed before, is what happens when the emergency order ends and, you know, the landlords can start increasing rent again. You know, people be able to afford, how much will the landlords be allowed to increase at one time, or will it be spread out over time to allow people to catch up if they were not able to get a stipend from the state or the county? And could that add to our, you know, to families forced to leave their, you know, their homes in West Hollywood? So it's something we should look at too.
Definitely. And that's imminent, the end of the subsidy. Fantastic. Well, just want to thank the Housing and Homelessness Subcommittee for the phenomenal work you're undertaking and all of the different angles you're coming at this issue, and thank the task force members at large for adding to this conversation. Again, the ability to see a gap, to bolster a more effective, comprehensive response. These are things that may seem minor to some, but they are big life difference makers. And so thank you all for looking at it through that lens and taking on the possibility of putting some very concrete and actionable things in front of council for consideration. I look forward to sitting and listening more deeply to you all in your next subcommittee meeting. So thank you for giving me a preview and the rest of us a preview of the great work that you're doing. With that, I am going to hand it back to the chairperson.
Thank you. Great topics, and I appreciate the work that my fellow comrades are doing. So with that said, moving on to item number 8. So items from the staff. This time is set aside for the city staff to provide any information they need to the Social Justice Task Force on items of interest that are items of interest to the task force as well. So with that said, Jasmine, or if any of your colleagues, Andy or Yvonne, want to speak as well.
Sure. So I have a few things. For the Housing and Homelessness Subcommittee, be on the lookout for an email from me just in terms of scheduling. We'll probably look to schedule a meeting next week. I think that's probably better for everyone's schedules. And I will make sure someone from the city's strategic initiatives division is there to kind of answer some of the questions that were raised during this conversation. Next thing is, so I'm not sure if you all saw for the draft policy recommendations, I think Vice Chair Zamilpa mentioned that for the last public safety subcommittee meeting, the city's governmental affairs liaison, Hernan Molina, attended the meeting. And we, as staff, we were thinking that it might be a good idea for him to attend a task force meeting. So that way, all of the members can kind of ask questions about certain legislative items that may be of interest to you all in forming some of the recommendations that you're creating. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. He has been creating documents for each of the commissions and advisory boards. Let me know when you can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So this is an example of the report that he can generate that's specific to items of interest for the Social Justice Task Force. So when he comes, I can make sure that I update him on some of the things that we talked about this evening and make sure that he includes bills and items that you all may find interesting. The goal that I think the task force should try and reach is in formulating your recommendations to also have a list of some of the legislative items that you may want the city to continue to support, or items that may not even be on council's radar that they should be looking into. And also just so that they know in your process for kind of formulating these recommendations, you've looked at these bills, you've spoken with governmental affairs staff, and they also went into, you know, your process for endorsing the recommendations that you're suggesting.
That's a very good point, Jasmine. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So yeah,
I'll question on that.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I know Adnan had mentioned that there is a tool that they use to sort of combine, whittle down from a list, think of like 2,000 bills he mentioned. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, we as a task force have to comb through 2,000 bills, but I'm just wondering, outside of the list that he compiles, is there anywhere where we should also be doing our additional research? Again, I think just with my current lessons in governmental affairs, I just want to make sure I'm putting in the work on my end as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a good question. I know that I'll be meeting with him later this week, so that's something I can always ask him too. I'm sure he'll have recommendations and ideas. Any other questions? Okay, and then the only other thing was, again, I will make sure to update I wanted to start housing all of our recommendations in one spot so everyone could be able to access it and it be visible. So I'll send that out to everyone so that way they have it. But once we kind of create some recommendations for the Housing and Homelessness Subcommittee for the next meeting, the goal is kind of like how we did with this one, for you all to start having the conversation all together, right? So members of the Public Safety Subcommittee can start asking members of the Economic Community Development Subcommittee, well, what about this? Or how would this look? Because we know a lot of these topics and subject matters kind of intersect. So I will make sure everyone has that and can start referencing it for future meetings.
One question, Jasmine. I know that or maybe maybe it's just the council, but I know that some people are starting to meet in person. So what does that look like from a social justice task force perspective?
Yeah, so they actually did have that discussion last night. And I think the vision is that commissions, advisory boards, and the task force will begin, I believe, meeting in person, I think in June. Andy, correct me if I'm wrong. But the goal is for you all to kind of transition to in person, which is interesting because I think we might be the only body that has never met in person. So our process will definitely be different than everyone else who, already had an identified location and whatnot. But I believe
they're not humanoids.
I believe that is the plan. Yes, yeah. June is the correct time period.
Yeah, the only I just remember I remember the city manager Wilson last night stating that hybrid meetings don't work very well. So I was like, so we're just gonna jump into it. One day we're gonna be on Zoom, and then next day we're gonna be in person. So I was just kind of curious how we need to prep for that, though.
Right. I mean, the good news is we do have some time between now and June to figure out what that looks like, and make sure that it's still accessible for you all. But yeah, June is the date we're looking at.
Good.
That's it for me, though.
That's it for you. Any of your colleagues want to speak?
Oh, I did have one more thing.
Okay.
And this is specifically for the Economic Community Development Subcommittee. We have had conversations with the city attorney and staff regarding the contracting and RFP process. We have one more follow-up meeting, but we should have updates to provide to you all by the April meeting, the next Social Justice Task Force meeting.
We got a timeline.
So, there we go. Yeah.
Thank you for that follow-up. Yeah, that's a big one. And then, for the record, I've also mentioned both on separate occasions to council members that any policy that they're pushing through at the higher level might be impacting our ability to be able to look at the RFPs. So, and they've stated their challenges. So, and I get it. So at the same time, we also need to be focused on how do we look at optimizing the RFP process. So great. Thank you for that. In terms of public comments, now moving, I'm sorry, if there's nothing else, I'll move on to item number 9. Yep.
Nothing on mine.
Cool. So item number 9. So public comment on matters not on the agenda. So this time is set aside for public comment. I'm looking around to see if there's anybody from the public. Okay, the public is given the opportunity to address Social Justice Task Force on any item within its responsibility. Pursuant to the Brown Act, the Social Justice Task Force cannot take action on any items not listed on the posted agenda. Each speaker will be allotted 2 minutes, and time may be limited or increased based on the discretion of the task force. This public comment period is to address Social Justice Task Force on agenda items or non-agenda items and or items of general interest within the jurisdiction of the Social Justice Task Force. Is there anybody on this call who wants to speak as a member of the public? All right, so I'm gonna move on to number 10, Task Force Liaison Reports. I think the real question here is, are there any reports that Task Force Liaisons would like to discuss I can tell you a little bit about my interactions with some of the other the groups that I've been, responsible for being a part of. I haven't really done, I'll be honest, I haven't done a great job of attending those things, attending the other meetings. I've tried to get report outs when I can, but I have tried to reach out, when possible, or accept invitations if people wanted to connect. So I did connect with Zakiah Wright from the Gay and Lesbian Task Force. And, we talked about some of the items related to public safety in particular. And so I introduced her to Daniel Zamilpa. Hopefully there's a room for partnership on that and to join together on different items for that. I also have had an opportunity to talk with the Human Services group. So on 2 different occasions, one was a report out that was, representing the Social Justice Task Force, and that was on March 8th. In addition to that, one of the members, Chelsea Byers, reached out to me to connect on some of the data. And so we did have a brief conversation on that. It was very positive. Again, a lot of interest in public safety as well. So if the Public Safety Committee would like to be introduced to the Human Services piece, happy to do that intro as well. It seems like there's a lot of room for collaboration. And the third thing is that the group that one of the groups I'm supposed to be working with is the Business License Commission. And so randomly happened to run into someone that was on that commission. And we spoke about, some of the things that we're trying to get forward from the economic subcommittee, just viability, whether or not it's even viable. And so had the opportunity to speak with happening to be the vice chair of the Business License Commission. And got some initial feedback, and then I think we're going to have further dialogue probably in the upcoming month or so. So stay tuned on that. But we're moving along. Partnership is everywhere. So any other liaison reports?
I did want to note that for the Transportation Commission, one thing I did want to discuss at the next meeting is just if we're seeing any impact of the re-implementation of fees for the metro system within Los Angeles. I know that it's a little tricky because West Hollywood is only a part of that. But if there is any assistance that we would want to recommend as far as funding for those affected, that's something I would like to discuss, and I'll keep you guys posted on that. I did want to also pose a question to the group. Given what is going on with Ukraine and Russia, I know we don't have anybody who is assigned to the Russian advisory board. I wanted to pose if anybody either wanted to volunteer. I'm happy to go to those, but was curious if anyone had any thoughts on that.
I think we should have someone assigned to the Russian advisory board. Do we not?
I believe the ones we don't have assigned, based off of the last list that I saw, was the Russian advisory board, the Historic Preservation Commission, and the Public Facilities Commission. But maybe schedules don't allow. So,
yeah, I mean, I would second a motion for you to be part of that if you want to.
Okay, I'll add that one to my list. Task Force Member Washington, I may need to lean on you for the disabilities one, just in case I can't make 2 Wednesdays in a row, but I will keep you posted.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then just for consistency's sake, would you all mind just making a motion and then seconding, just because we voted on the liaisons last time, so just so.
Jonathan Wilson would like to make a motion that Vice Chair Zamilpa be part of the Russian Advisory Committee as a liaison for the Social Justice Task Force. Is there a second?
I'm happy to second.
Okay. Thank you, Task Force Member Krupa. Desai.
Awesome. I will do a quick roll call. Chair Wilson,
Aye.
Vice Chair Zamilpa,
Hi.
Task Force Member Desai,
Aye.
Task Force Member Smith,
Aye.
Task Force Member Morton,
Aye.
Task Force Member Washington.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you.
Cool. Looking forward to bringing updates out of that commission as well, or that advisory board.
Do we also vote on the task force members Washington being a backup or also being part of that, or how does that work?
Well,
Disability.
the task force member Washington is we're currently both on disability, so I think I was just asking just in case I can't make the disability
got
thing.
it. Oh,
Yeah.
got it. I wasn't sure where that was coming from, so I was
No, not signing you up for anything else.
for the clarity.
Task
No,
member
that was important.
And
Good.
just a reminder too, if you all can't attend the meetings, that's okay. But if you do have time to just, look through the minutes and just see if there are things that may be related to things that we've discussed, that's also helpful too.
And I appreciated that cue, Jasmine. I wasn't able to go to the Planning Commission meeting, but did look through the minutes. The minutes are not super detailed though. So, but the one thing that I would just raise in the context of our work that I do want to follow up on and at least figure out what is specifically going on is related to affordable housing planning. There seemed to be a discussion there. Based on the minutes, it looked like it was coming off the table. I don't know if anybody here has context for that, but that was at least the minutes that made me want to.
Is that what they were discussing last night with the potential of rezoning?
I don't know. I
think that conversation did encompass what housing would kind of look like. But I will add that to my list because I think it is something when we originally created the Housing and Homelessness and Social Services Subcommittee that we would kind of address housing in that vein too. So it's something that I can add to my list for that subcommittee. And hopefully a larger conversation can be had.
For context for last night's meeting as it relates to affordable housing, from my understanding, again, just tapping into that meeting and not having the full context, so apologies if I misspeak on anything. There is an annual submission, from what I understand, that each city has to submit to the states as it specifically relates to funding that we then receive. From what it sounded like, the collective council members were felt like we would push more. We should have more affordable housing, and not just affordable rental housing, but affordable purchase housing. I believe Councilmember D'Amico's words were, we shouldn't make more housing for rich people. And I believe that there is potential of receiving either some sort of a fine or penalty if that isn't submitted by a certain date. But we are in an interesting position of, it's usually cities that are late because they are not meeting the standards. We're trying to exceed our own standards, which is why I think either we may be asking for more time or whatever, but I believe that's why council was not ready to approve that plan.
Great. Should we move on to item number 11? So items from task force members and subcommittee reports. So let's discuss our progress and updates. Are there any key items that want to be brought forth by individual task members, not necessarily related to your subcommittee? I haven't. Oh
no, go ahead.
No, go task force member Smith.
Have we considered, now that everything's pretty much open, having a listening session, an in-person listening session with the public to listen to ideas, to listen to comments and whatnot? And is that possible?
I mean,
So I don't want to cut off any of the conversation for you all, but I think because the city is already identifying June as that in-person transition date, I think that you all will be pretty close to finalizing your recommendations at that point. So in my mind, I was envisioning having those engagement meetings to get feedback before you present them to council. But more than open to kind of having that conversation if you all want it to look different.
No, I think that's a great target.
and thank you. And that also kind of segues into something I was going to ask during this time period, which is I would like for staff to help us understand how we go about seeking an extension for the Social Justice Task Force, if that has to be formally put before council or how that works. But would love for the next in the next agenda to have that for discussion so we can figure out the how, assuming that all of my my fellow task force members would be interested in having that be an extension, or if it become, or recommending that it be a permanent item. So that's something that I think there might be value in us considering as a group. But I would like for staff to help us with what the process might be for that.
When you say extension, what do you mean? Like when you all present your recommendations to city council, or?
Well, as of right now, this is only supposed to be for a year, right? And our first meeting actually technically was May of last year. So, I mean, a year technically it's over at April, right? Technically. However, you know, for us to go through May and June and have a few more months even after that, that can be an extension. A recommending that we actually extend this to be more than a year or so beyond this, I think would be great, because that'll allow us to go through the multiple phases of implementation and revising. So it'll allow us to, number one, we can cultivate our recommendations further during this period, right? And then as a you know, summer break, right, for summer, then we go into really kind of starting to implement or working towards executing on our recommendations, right? And then we can actually transition to other people who may be interested in also seeing an impact for BIPOC people within the city of West Hollywood. That's where my mind is headed. I don't have a timeline on it, but I just think that April is probably not reasonable, and we need to make some kind of plan around this. So, Vice Chair Zamilpa, it sounds like you have something to say.
Yeah, actually, I think that's there's a lot to think about there. From my understanding, I believe we were approved for 2 years as a term, but I don't believe that necessarily means that I don't recall the exact specificities, but I also think it's like, what does this then become at the 1 year mark, at the 2 year mark? Does this go away? Are we, you know, I don't think that social justice issues are going to be done after that. I think it's definitely something that I would urge city council to consider thinking about what this looks like. I mean, if it's a recommendation that we make as a group of how, you know, do we continue as one body? Does this get absorbed into other commissions? I don't know. I think that's something that we definitely should. I think that's the right time to talk about.
I think we're deeply aligned on this one, so yeah. we need to figure out what this looks like. So that is definitely something from, yeah,
and that's definitely something that I can speak with staff about and provide definitely an update next meeting.
And then understanding the timeline that you mentioned as well, I wanted to ask all of, and this is not meant to be a pressure, but more from a timeline perspective, just no name calling or anything like that, but just I would love it if all the subcommittees could have a 3 to 5 recommendations for the next 3 to 5 actionable recommendations, even if they're like small actions. But to have that for the April, I think that's in line with what you said, Jasmine, but the other pieces too. Also, we can start talking about it and get to the point where in June we can have something that will be really awesome, right? So, because we have to talk as a group, and we all have opinions, right? So it's probably not going to be done on a first conversation. That was it. Oh, and then at this point, we did have the discussions today. Are there any items that need to be brought forth by the subcommittees in addition to what was talked about earlier today? Well, since we didn't talk about economic development, I will say that we did submit 3 initial, and these are really rough draft recommendations, but they are quick hits. They are quick hit recommendations, and so it's really expanding on. Oh, look at that! All right, yeah, bring them up. So, can you enlarge a little bit for me? Hold on. Oh, there he goes. It was actually my screen wasn't open all the way. All right, so the items are really, number one, we want to make sure that we want to work on trying to possibly amend the annual business registration form to include some optional fields, one around BIPOC ownership, right? So the affiliated race for BIPOC, and then the total number of employees, number of BIPOC employees, number of BIPOC managers and above, right? So those are just some ideas around a tangible recommendation. A second one, and I understand that there is some effort to add or modify the form already, and I don't know what that is yet, but I understand there's something happening there. The second recommendation is around the city webpage for businesses, and so if there's a way to step through that, right? So what does it look like for somebody who doesn't know anything about starting a business to start a business here in West Hollywood? And how can we make sure we have tutorials, and maybe we can partner with some of the surrounding businesses or nonprofits to mentor and shepherd people through the process, maybe even have a small playbook on the side. The third one is, while it may be hard to have our own certification process, it would be interesting to see if we can have a minority certification of some sort, that maybe it piggybacks off of existing certifications. So it's more like a if the city of Los Angeles certified somebody for being a disadvantaged business or minority business enterprise, that we could say you're hereby also certified within the city of West Hollywood, and give them additional at least recognition. And then the other piece is from the federal and state level. How do we partner to give people visibility and to allow them to use the certifications they've already gone through? I mean, I can tell you as a business owner myself, it is a long process to get a certification. So to want to go through it again for each city I would be a part of would be exhausting. So I can tell you the other side of it too. We are getting pushback a little bit from the city in terms of having our own certification process. So I think that might be something that we can look into, but these are definitely very rough recommendations. So and require additional buy-in, as well as kind of evolution. So thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I would say these are all great. The one that I would think about it a little bit more, as you're going to, is recognizing intersectionality between whiteness and queerness. I think is West Hollywood is specifically a place where that I think can be used as a checkbox, but we want to make sure that we are thinking about other intersectionality. So I'll just say that.
Sorry, maybe help me understand. In which recommendation are you thinking about that, or are you just thinking it holistically?
Yeah, I think specifically the third one, like what qualifies as a a minority certified business.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
It's by the standards of, it's going to be by, but you know what? It's not up to us, but in the same vein that someone goes through an NGLCC certification, who knows? The Gay and Lesbian Board might suggest that that also become a certification for the city of West Hollywood. I don't know, but I'm really focused more on the MBE that is being looked at within the city of Los Angeles, as well as some other certifications. So I appreciate your comment. It's not in lieu of other certifications. We just need to be really focused in terms of what we are recommending as the representation for BIPOC people in the city of West Hollywood. And I also say that's a proud gay man. So, anyways, so keep it moving. At this point, if there's no other additional comments, I will move for us to get this adjourned. It's up to you guys. No more comments, it looks like, from my colleagues here. All right, so thank you all for a great meeting. We will talk again. I'm sorry, I don't have the date in front of me. The fourth Tuesday. Thank you. April 26th. Look forward to seeing you guys then.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.